My mom forged my signature to sell my house for my brother's college. Her reaction when I sued her: I pierced my wife's condom because she was cheating on me, and this is what came out of it. My wife cheated on me with a rich guy from the business center. For that, I ruined her life with one social media poll. Hi, my name is Sandy, and today I want to share my story. It's not an easy one to tell, and maybe, just maybe, some of you will see a reflection of your own life in it. Family can be the greatest source of love and security, but for some of us, it becomes the source of our deepest pain. We all face difficult family dynamics at times, but my situation was something I never expected, a path I never thought I'd walk. This is the story of how I broke ties with my mother, Linda. I've always envied those who speak fondly of their mothers, who say things like, "My mom is my best friend," or "I can't imagine life without her." To be honest, I can't relate to that at all. For me, the word mother doesn't conjure up feelings of warmth or safety. Instead, it's a complicated mix of emotions: bitterness, sadness, and maybe even a bit of longing for something that could have been but never was. From the very beginning, my relationship with my mother was different, cold, detached. I often wondered if I did something wrong, or if there was something about me she couldn't love. I'd watch other mothers and daughters laugh together at the park or shopping for dresses for some special occasion, and I couldn't help but wonder why my mother and I weren't like that. Why couldn't we have those moments? The reality was that my childhood was marked by an emotional distance I couldn't bridge. But things really began to fall apart after my parents divorced. I was just 12 when my father, James, walked out. He couldn't handle it anymore. My mother's endless criticism, her constant unhappiness, it finally broke him. And when he left, I was the one who stayed behind, stuck in the middle of a storm I had no control over. Suddenly, it was just me and my mother. You'd think that would bring us closer, right? After all, it was just the two of us now. But instead of bonding, we grew even more distant. It felt like we were strangers living under the same roof, forced to interact, but without any real connection. I miss my dad terribly. He had been my safe place, the one person who seemed to understand me. But he was gone, and I was left to navigate life with a mother who barely seemed to notice I existed. That's when I first started feeling truly alone. The months following the divorce were tough. It's strange to say, but in a way, I felt like I had lost both of my parents. My dad wasn't there physically, and my mother, well, emotionally, she had never been fully present. After my father left, I kept hoping that maybe now, without the constant tension between them, she and I would find some common ground. But instead, it felt like she was slipping further away from me, retreating into her own world. That's when Mark entered the picture. I don't know exactly when they met, but it wasn't long after the divorce was finalized. I came home from school one afternoon, and there he was, sitting in our living room as if he had always been there. He was polite enough to me, but I couldn't help feeling uncomfortable. Everything was happening so fast. I hadn't even come to terms with the fact that my dad was gone, and now this new man was suddenly a part of our lives. My mother seemed happy, though, or at least happier than I had seen her in a long time. I wanted to be happy for her. I really did. If Mark could fill that void in her life, maybe things would get better between us. But instead, his arrival only made me feel more isolated. My mother's attention was entirely focused on him. Dinners, conversations, even weekends became centered around Mark. They were like a couple lost in their own bubble, and I felt like an intruder in my own home. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong in this new version of our family. Then, not long after, they had Ryan, my half-brother. I'll never forget the day he was born. My mother's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. She was glowing with pride and joy. I remember standing in the hospital room, watching her cradle him in her arms, her smile wide and genuine. I wanted to be happy for her, for our family, but I couldn't ignore the tightening in my chest. As I stood there, I realized that Ryan wasn't just my little brother. He represented the new life my mother had built, a life that didn't seem to have much space left for me. From then on, it was as if I had been pushed to the sidelines. Mark and my mother were busy with Ryan, and I slowly faded into the background. I was 13 when Ryan was born, old enough to notice how things were shifting, but too young to know what to do about it. I tried to help, offering to babysit or take care of him when they needed a break. But every time I held Ryan, I felt the distance between me and my mother growing wider. She had her new family now, a husband and a baby, and I was just a leftover piece from her old life. At night, I'd lie awake in my room, listening to the sounds of laughter and conversation coming from downstairs, where my mother and Mark would sit together, playing with Ryan. The house was full of noise, but none of it was for me. I felt like a ghost, silently wandering through my own home, unseen and unheard. That's when the loneliness truly set in. The feeling of being the extra child, the one who didn't quite fit in, grew stronger with each passing day. As the years passed, the feeling of being an outsider only intensified. I tried to convince myself that things weren't so bad, that maybe I was just overreacting. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just that my mother's attention was on her new husband and son. She had become almost indifferent toward me. The conversations we used to have, the small moments we might have shared, were replaced by quick exchanges, barely more than a few words. By the time I was 15, I had mastered the art of invisibility. I'd come home from school, grab something to eat, and retreat to my room without anyone really noticing. My mother was always busy. Whether it was with Mark, Ryan, or her job, I never knew, because she never told me. The house felt less like a home and more like a place I was just passing through. I started spending more time at friends' houses, avoiding being home as much as possible. But no matter how much time I spent away, I couldn't escape the gnawing feeling of being forgotten. I began to notice small things, moments that stung more than I liked to admit. I'd walk into a room where Mark and my mother were laughing about something Ryan had done, and the laughter would die down as soon as they saw me. There were family dinners where I sat quietly, barely acknowledged, while the conversation flowed around me, all about Ryan's first steps or Mark's latest promotion. I felt like I was just a bystander, watching their life unfold from the sidelines, a life that I wasn't really part of anymore. The worst part was how my mother seemed to have completely changed around Ryan. She doted on him, showering him with affection and attention in a way that I had never experienced. I would watch as she hugged him, kissed his forehead, and called him her little angel, and I'd wonder why I never got that from her. Had she always been capable of that kind of love? And if so, why had I been left out? It was a question that haunted me for years. One day, when I was 16, I tried to talk to her about it. It was a rare evening when it was just the two of us. Mark had taken Ryan to visit his parents, and the house was unusually quiet. I remember sitting across from her at the kitchen table, gathering the courage to speak up. I told her how I had been feeling, that I felt like she had forgotten about me, that I was being pushed aside. I didn't know what kind of response I expected, but I thought, at the very least, she'd listen. But she didn't. She brushed it off, telling me that I was being overly sensitive, that I needed to understand she had a lot on her plate. "You're old enough to take care of yourself," she said with a hint of irritation in her voice. "Ryan needs me more right now." I nodded, trying to swallow the lump forming in my throat, but her words echoed in my mind long after that conversation ended. From that moment on, I stopped trying. I stopped looking for her approval, her attention, her love. I knew it wasn't coming. I focused on my schoolwork, my friends, and spent as little time at home as possible. I figured if I could just make it through high school, I'd be out of there, away from the life that didn't seem to have room for me. But then, when I was 17, something happened that changed everything. It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those days when the house was quiet, and I figured my mother was out running errands or with Ryan somewhere. I was looking for a textbook I had left downstairs when I heard voices. I thought it was Mark at first, but then I realized the voice was unfamiliar. Curious, I walked toward the sound and stopped just outside my mother's bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Through the crack in the door, I saw her. My mother, Linda, was with another man. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart racing and my stomach sinking. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My mother, Linda, was with another man, someone I had never seen before. They were laughing, completely unaware that I was there, watching. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there, unable to process what I was witnessing. My legs felt weak, and I had to steady myself against the wall to keep from collapsing. 1,000 thoughts rushed through my mind. Why was she doing this? What about Mark? What about Ryan? Was this some kind of mistake? I kept hoping there was some explanation that would make sense of it all, but deep down I knew there wasn't. My mother was cheating on her husband, and now I was carrying a secret I never asked for. I quietly backed away from the door, my hands trembling as I tiptoed to my room. Once inside, I closed the door softly and sat on my bed, staring at the wall. I didn't cry, not at first. I was too numb to feel anything other than shock. The woman I had been living with, the one I called Mom, had betrayed not only her husband but our entire family. I felt sick. How could she do this? After everything we had been through, after all the distance and silence between us, this was a final blow. Any hope I had left of repairing our relationship was shattered in that moment. Hours passed, but I stayed in my room, replaying the scene over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to confront her, to ask her why, but every time I imagined it, I couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I even say? I saw you with him. Would she deny it? Brush me off like she always did when I tried to talk about anything serious? And then there was Mark. Did he know? Should I tell him? What would that do to Ryan? As much as I hated the situation, I felt trapped by the secret. My relationship with my mother was already strained beyond repair, but I wasn't ready for the fallout that would come if this truth got out. I knew it could tear our family apart, and as much as I felt like an outsider, part of me still didn't want to destroy everything. But the weight of what I had seen was suffocating, and over the next few weeks, I became a different person. I withdrew even more, isolating myself from my friends and burying myself in schoolwork, just trying to survive the days. My mother, of course, had no idea that I knew. She carried on as if nothing had changed, but to me, everything had. Every time I looked at her, I saw a stranger. I couldn't stand to be in the same room with her, the woman who had lied not only to her family but to me, her own daughter. Every smile she gave, every word she said, felt fake. I knew the truth, and it poisoned every interaction we had. The final breaking point came a few months later. It was one of those rare mornings when everyone was home. I was having breakfast in silence while my mother and Mark were talking in the next room. They sounded so normal, like any other couple, and for a moment, I was overwhelmed by the hypocrisy of it all. How could she lie to him like that, right to his face? I couldn't take it anymore. I put my spoon down, stood up, and walked out of the house without saying a word. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away from them. I ended up at my father's house. My dad, James, had always been the one I could count on, and that day was no different. When I showed up at his doorstep without warning, he didn't ask questions. He just let me in. I sat down on the couch and finally, the tears came. I told him everything about how I felt like I didn't belong, about how my mother had been distant for years, and finally, about the man I saw her with. My dad listened quietly, not saying much, but I could tell from his face that he was furious on my behalf. "You don't have to go back there," he said gently, after a long silence. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't going to. I couldn't live under the same roof with her anymore. The trust, the little that was left, was gone. So, I packed my things and moved in with my dad. That night, as I lay in bed in my new room, I realized something. This wasn't just about my mother's affair. This was about everything that had built up over the years. The neglect, the feeling of being invisible, the distance that had grown between us. Her betrayal with that man was just a final piece of the puzzle. And now, it was time for me to walk away for good. Moving in with my dad felt like a fresh start, Or at least, that's what I told myself. His house was quiet, a stark contrast to the noise and tension I had grown used to. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells. I didn't have to brace myself for the cold shoulder from my mother, the forced smiles, or the family dinners that felt more like performances. I could just be. It was a relief I hadn't realized I needed. My dad, James, did everything he could to make me feel at home. He never pressured me to talk about what had happened or why I had left so suddenly. Instead, he gave me the space to process it all on my own. We fell into a comfortable routine. Dinners together, watching TV in the evenings, just the two of us. It was nice, simple, but even in that quiet, a part of me couldn't let go of the past. Every time I walked past the boxes of my belongings in the corner of my new room, I was reminded of the life I had left behind. I wanted to believe that moving out of my mother's house meant leaving all the pain and confusion behind, but it wasn't that easy. My thoughts were constantly drawn back to her. Linda, what was she thinking? Did she even care that I was gone? Or was she too wrapped up in her new life with Mark and Ryan to notice? The first few weeks after I moved out were eerily silent. My mother didn't call. She didn't come looking for me. I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised. After all, our relationship had been crumbling for years. But a part of me still hoped she'd reach out, that maybe this would be the wake-up call she needed. Maybe she'd realize what she had lost, and we could finally have that conversation I had been yearning for. But no call came. No knock at the door. Eventually, my dad tried to gently broach the subject. "Have you heard from your mom?" he asked one evening, his voice careful, like he didn't want to stir up any emotions I wasn't ready to face. I shook my head, trying to brush it off like it didn't matter, but inside, it did. It hurt more than I was willing to admit. "Well, if you want to talk to her, I'm sure she'd want to hear from you," he added, though we both knew that wasn't true. My dad was trying to be diplomatic, but we both understood the reality. My mother and I had been drifting apart for so long that it felt like we were on different planets now. And I had no intention of bridging that gap. Instead, I threw myself into my new life. I focused on school, pouring all my energy into my studies and planning for the future. I had always been a good student, but now it felt like the only thing I had control over. I had dreams of going to college, of leaving this town behind, and building a life for myself far away from the wreckage of my family. That became my goal, escape. It was the only thing that kept me going, the light at the end of a very long, very dark tunnel. During those months, I barely spoke to my mother. When I did see her, on rare occasions, usually when picking up some forgotten item from the old house, it was brief and awkward. We didn't talk about the fact that I had moved out. We didn't talk about the man I had caught her with, or the real reason I had left. It was like we were two strangers, exchanging meaningless pleasantries. "How's school?" she'd ask. "Fine," I'd reply. That was the extent of it. But the longer the silence stretched, the more something inside me hardened. If my mother didn't want to fight for our relationship, then neither would I. I was done waiting for her to notice me, done trying to fix something that had been broken for far too long. And just when I thought I had finally put some distance between us, physically and emotionally, life had one more cruel twist in store for me. It came on a cloudy afternoon, months after I had settled into my new life with my dad. I was at school when I got the call. My father had passed away, suddenly, from a heart attack. 1 minute, he was there, my rock, the one person I could count on. The next, he was gone, just like that. The phone call felt like a punch to the gut. I remember standing in the hallway at school, the world around me moving in slow motion as the words sank in, "Your father is gone." I dropped the phone, barely able to breathe. How could this be real? Just that morning, we had shared a quick breakfast before I left for school, nothing out of the ordinary. I had no idea it would be the last time I'd ever see him. I don't even remember how I got home that day. Everything became a blur. My heart felt like it had been ripped out of my chest, and the grief was so heavy I could barely stand. My father, My rock, the only person who had always been there for me, was gone. The loss was overwhelming, like a tidal wave that I couldn't escape. I had lost my dad, and with him, the only sense of stability I had left. The days that followed were a haze of phone calls, paperwork, and endless condolences from people who didn't really know what to say. He was such a kind man, they'd tell me. He loved you so much. I nodded, but their words barely registered. I couldn't focus on anything other than the gaping hole that had opened up inside me. My dad had always been the one I could turn to, the one who understood me when no one else did. Now, I was truly alone. After the funeral, reality began to sink in. My father had left me the apartment I had been living in, a small but comfortable place that I had come to think of as my sanctuary. It wasn't much, but it was mine, or so I thought. As we began sorting through the legal documents and handling my father's estate, I made a discovery that would change everything. The apartment, the one my dad had promised would be my safe place, wasn't entirely mine. On the deed, listed alongside my father's name, was my mother's. Linda. It was like a cruel joke, a reminder that no matter how far I tried to distance myself from her, she was always lurking in the background. At first, I didn't think much of it. My dad had probably kept her name on the paperwork out of convenience, never expecting it to matter. I certainly didn't expect her to interfere. After all, she had her own life, her own family. She barely even acknowledged me anymore. Why would she care about the apartment? But as it turned out, I was wrong. So very wrong. A few weeks after my father's death, I received a call from a lawyer. At first, I didn't understand what he was saying. He was talking about the apartment, about some documents, and then he mentioned my mother's name. It took a few moments for the reality to sink in. My mother had forged my signature. She had taken advantage of her name being on the deed, signed documents as if she were me, and sold the apartment behind my back. I felt a numbness creep over me as I listened to the lawyer explain what had happened. She had sold the one thing my dad had left me, the only place I had to call home. And for what? To pay for Ryan's education. My half-brother, her new son, had once again taken precedence in her life. I didn't even matter to her, not enough to keep the promise my father had made to me. I was stunned, speechless. How could she do this? How could she betray me like this after everything we had already been through? My mother had taken the last thing I had, and in that moment, I realized there was no going back. There was no salvaging what was left of our relationship. The shock quickly turned to anger, anger so deep that it felt like it was burning a hole in my chest. I couldn't let her get away with this. I wouldn't let her get away with this. The time for silence was over. I wasn't going to stand by and let her steal from me, just like she had stolen my childhood, my sense of belonging, my trust. That's when I decided to take action. I contacted a lawyer of my own and filed a lawsuit against my mother for forgery and fraud. I didn't care how long it would take or how hard it would be. I was ready to fight her, fight for what was mine. It wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It was about standing up for myself, something I had never really done when it came to Linda. She had always held the power in our relationship, always the one in control, but not anymore. Not this time. The legal battle that followed was exhausting. My mother denied everything, of course. She painted herself as the victim, claiming she had done what was best for Ryan, that it was for family. But her lies didn't hold up. The court ruled in my favor, and she was found guilty. The day the verdict was announced, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also a deep sadness. It was a hollow victory, one that came at the cost of what little remained of our family. My mother was sentenced to prison for fraud. I got my apartment back, but it was hard to feel like I had won. The truth was, I had lost far more than just an apartment. I had lost my father, and with him, the last piece of stability in my life. And now, I had lost my mother, too, though in many ways, she had been gone long before the lawsuit. Winning the lawsuit didn't feel like a triumph. Sure, I had the apartment back, but the process had left me drained in ways I couldn't even describe. My mother was going to prison, and I'd gotten some semblance of justice, but it didn't bring me peace. In fact, it left a deeper scar than I expected. The court ruling should have been a moment of closure, but instead, it felt like another chapter in a story I wanted to end. The bitterness between us had grown so deep, and now we were on opposite sides of a courtroom, not just a fractured family. Seeing her in court, sitting across from me, was surreal. She didn't even look at me, not once. Her face was cold, her gaze fixed forward, as if I wasn't even there. I guess, in a way, I hadn't been there for her in years, just as she hadn't been there for me. The day she was sentenced, I sat in silence after the judge's words. My mother, Linda, was now a convicted criminal, guilty of forging her own daughter's name, guilty of betraying the last remnants of trust between us. She was taken away, and just like that, it was over. But it didn't feel over. I thought about Ryan. What was he thinking? What did he know? He was still young, probably too young to fully understand what was happening. I wondered if Mark had told him the truth, or if they had tried to shield him from it. Either way, his life had been turned upside down, too. My relationship with Ryan was complicated. I cared for him, but in many ways, he was a symbol of everything I had lost. And now his mother, our mother, was in prison because of me. After the sentencing, I went back to the apartment. It felt strange to be there, knowing what it had cost to get it back. The rooms felt emptier than before, even though nothing had changed physically. I looked around and realized it wasn't just an apartment anymore. It had become the symbol of all the battles I had fought, not just with my mother, but with myself. I sat down on the floor in the living room, my back against the wall, and let the tears come. They had been building for months, years even, but I had held them in, refusing to show any weakness. But now, alone in that space, the weight of everything finally broke me. I cried for my father, for the unfairness of losing him so suddenly. I cried for the little girl I had been, who had tried so hard to make her mother love her, and for the teenager who had been pushed aside when Ryan was born. I cried for the woman I had become, who had just sent her own mother to prison. But after the tears, there was a strange sense of calm. I don't know if it was acceptance or simply exhaustion, but something shifted inside me that day. I realized that my mother had taken so much from me over the years, but I wasn't going to let her take my future. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could decide how to move forward. The days following the sentencing were quiet. I heard nothing from Mark or Ryan. Part of me wanted to reach out to them, to explain my side of things, to let them know that I hadn't wanted to end like this. But what would I even say? The truth was, I had burned a bridge that couldn't be rebuilt. And maybe, deep down, that was for the best. With my mother in prison, the connection to that part of my life was severed completely. I didn't visit her, and I didn't plan to. The idea of facing her again, even for a conversation, felt impossible. I had said everything I needed to say in court, and anything more would only reopen wounds that hadn't even begun to heal. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my life. The apartment became more than just a symbol of the past. It became a place where I could start over. I redecorated, changed the furniture, made it truly my own. Each change, each new piece of furniture, felt like another step toward reclaiming my life. I didn't want to be haunted by what had happened anymore. I wanted to live. But even as I moved forward, the past wasn't something I could forget. There were still nights when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if things could have been different. Could I have saved my relationship with my mother? Could she have changed? Or had we always been on this path, doomed to collide in the worst way possible? The questions lingered, but I knew there were no answers. All I could do was accept what had happened and keep moving forward. After the sentencing, I assumed my mother's world had completely crumbled, and by extension, so had Mark's and Ryan's. It felt like our already fractured family had fully collapsed. I didn't expect to hear from Mark ever again. What could he possibly want to say to me after what had happened? But a few weeks later, he called. I remember staring at the phone when I saw his name flash across the screen, hesitating before answering. My heart was pounding. What could he possibly want? The call itself felt like a confrontation I wasn't ready for. I expected anger, accusations, maybe even blame. After all, I had been the one to file the lawsuit that landed my mother in prison. But when I answered, his voice wasn't angry. It was calm, tired, even. "Sandy, we need to talk," he said. "I think there's a lot you don't know." I agreed to meet him, though I was nervous. The last time I had seen him was in court, when he had sat in stunned silence as the truth about my mother came out. I didn't know what he could possibly say that would change anything, but a part of me needed closure that I hadn't found in the courtroom. We met at a small cafe, one that I hadn't been to since I was a kid. As I walked in, I saw him sitting at a table in the corner, looking much older than I remembered. The stress of everything had clearly taken its toll on him. He waved me over, and I sat down, unsure of how to start the conversation. But I didn't need to. Mark got straight to the point. "I should have seen it coming," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Your mother, Linda, there were signs, but I didn't want to see them." He explained how, over the years, he had noticed changes in her, subtle at first, but growing more obvious as time went on. She had become distant, not just with me, but with him as well. He had tried to convince himself it was stress or the pressures of raising Ryan, but deep down, he had known something was wrong. He just didn't want to face it. "I thought I could fix it," he admitted. "I thought if I worked harder, made more time for her, things would get better. But the truth is, she had already checked out. She wasn't the person I fell in love with anymore." I sat there, listening quietly, unsure of what to say. Hearing this from Mark was strange. He had always been the one constant in my mother's new life, the man she had chosen to build a family with. But now, even he seemed to realize how much she had changed. "And then there was the affair," he continued, his voice quieter now. "You're not the only one who knew, Sandy. I suspected something for a while, but I never wanted to believe it. Until you told me, my heart skipped a beat." So he knew. He had known about my mother's affair, even before I had told him. It made sense now, why things had seemed so tense between them in those final years. Still, hearing it from him was painful. I had held on to the guilt of that secret for so long, believing that by keeping it, I had protected Ryan and Mark. But the truth was, they had been living in the shadow of that betrayal for years, just like I had. "I wish I had been stronger," he said, looking down at the table. "Maybe if I had confronted her earlier, things would have been different. Maybe we wouldn't be sitting here right now." I shook my head, finally finding my voice. "It's not your fault, Mark. It's not mine either. She made her choices." He nodded, though the sadness in his eyes didn't fade. "I filed for divorce, you know. After everything came out in court, there was no going back. Ryan and I were moving away. I can't stay here anymore." His words hit me harder than I expected. Mark had been the last connection I had to that part of my life, to the family I had once been a part of, even if only on the edges. And now, he was leaving too. It felt like the final door closing on the life I had once known. "I wanted you to know," he continued, "that I don't blame you for what happened. None of this is your fault. Your mother, she wasn't well, Sandy. She hadn't been for a long time." His words lingered in the air between us. She wasn't well. It was something I had never really considered before. I had always seen my mother as cold, distant, selfish. But hearing Mark talk about her this way made me wonder if there was something deeper going on, something I had missed. "I just wanted you to know," Mark said again, his voice soft. "I'm sorry for everything." We sat in silence for a few minutes after that, the weight of his words settling in. There wasn't much more to say. We both knew that this was goodbye, not just to each other, but to the family that could have been. As I left the cafe, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness, Yes, but also a sense of finality. Mark and Ryan were moving on, and now, so was I. My mother's choices had shattered our lives, but in the aftermath, we were all finding our own way forward. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. After that meeting with Mark, something inside me shifted. It was as if a weight I had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. Hearing him say that he didn't blame me, that none of this was my fault, was a validation I hadn't realized I needed. It wasn't just about the lawsuit or the apartment anymore. It was about years of confusion and guilt, about the little girl who had wondered what she had done wrong to make her mother turn away. Mark's words, simple as they were, gave me permission to let go of some of that weight. But even with that newfound clarity, moving forward wasn't easy. I had lost both of my parents in the span of just a few months, my father to death and my mother to betrayal. And now, with Mark and Ryan moving away, it felt like the last threads tying me to my old life were being cut. I was on my own, truly, for the first time. I had to figure out what my life was going to look like now, without them. I focused on the apartment, making it a space where I could finally feel at peace. I painted the walls, got new furniture, and rearranged everything to reflect the person I was becoming, not the person who had been defined by a broken family. I even created a little reading nook by the window, a place where I could curl up with a book and let my mind drift away from the chaos that had dominated my life for so long. But even as I rebuilt my space, there were moments when the quiet was too much. The silence in the apartment could be suffocating. I had spent so many years surrounded by noise. My mother's distant conversations, Ryan's laughter, the tension in the house, and now in the stillness, I sometimes found myself feeling lonelier than ever. I wasn't just mourning the loss of my family. I was mourning the loss of what could have been. I knew that my mother and I would never have the relationship I had once dreamed of. I had accepted that, but the thought still lingered in those quiet moments. What if? I tried to fill the silence by keeping myself busy. I enrolled in college and threw myself into my studies, determined to make something of myself. If I had learned anything from everything I had been through, it was that I couldn't rely on anyone else to give me the life I wanted. It was up to me now. My father had always believed in me, and I wanted to honor his memory by becoming the strong, independent person he had always encouraged me to be. College became my escape. It was a place where no one knew my story, where I could just be Sandy, the girl studying psychology, the girl who loved reading and writing and finding meaning in the world around her. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life. I wasn't just reacting to the pain anymore. I was building something new, something for myself. I made new friends, too. People who didn't know about my past, who didn't see me as a girl with a complicated family. It was refreshing to be able to talk about normal things, classes, weekend plans, our favorite books, without the shadow of my mother looming over every conversation. And for a while, I was happy, really happy. But there were still moments when the past crept in uninvited. It happened in the small moments, like when I'd see a mother and daughter laughing together on campus, or when I'd hear someone talk about their parents with such warmth and affection. Those moments would hit me like a wave, reminding me of the absence in my own life. My relationship with Linda wasn't something I could just erase, no matter how far I tried to run from it. I thought about her sometimes, wondered what she was doing, how she was coping in prison. I wondered if she thought about me, if she regretted anything. I never visited her, though. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Every time I even considered it, I was reminded of all the ways she had hurt me, all the times she had chosen others, Mark, Ryan, even herself, over me, and I knew I wasn't ready to face her. Maybe I never would be. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe she wasn't well, like Mark had said. Maybe there was more to her story than I had ever known. But even if that were true, it didn't change the fact that she had made her choices, and those choices had hurt me deeply. Forgiveness, if it ever came, wasn't something I was ready for. So I focused on the present. I focused on building a life that wasn't defined by my mother or by the pain of the past. I worked hard in school, made plans for the future, and allowed myself to dream of the things I wanted for myself. I had spent so many years feeling like I didn't matter, like I was an extra in someone else's life. But now, for the first time, I was putting myself first. I was the main character in my own story, and that felt good. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of it all still pressed down on me. But I was learning slowly how to carry that weight without letting it crush me. I was learning how to be whole, even with the pieces of my past still scattered around me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly starting over. As much as I tried to focus on my new life, the past had a way of creeping back in. I couldn't fully escape it, no matter how hard I tried. Every time I thought I had moved on, something would pull me back. An old photo I stumbled across, a fleeting memory, or a simple reminder of the life I had left behind. One afternoon, during a break between classes, I received an unexpected letter. It was from the prison. My heart stopped when I saw my mother's name on the return address. I had spent so long trying to block her out of my life that seeing her handwriting again felt like a punch to the gut. I stared at the envelope for what felt like hours, unsure if I even wanted to open it. But curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what she had to say. The letter was short, only a few paragraphs, but it was enough to stir up everything I had been trying to bury. She apologized, something I had never expected from her. She wrote about how much she regretted the choices she had made, how she knew she had hurt me more than she could ever repair. She didn't try to explain or justify her actions, but she did mention that she had been in therapy since going to prison. For the first time, she admitted that she had been struggling with her own issues for years, issues she had never faced until it was too late. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Sandy," she wrote. "I know I haven't been the mother you needed. I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I think about you every day. I'm sorry." Reading those words, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me had been waiting for an apology for years, hoping that maybe one day she'd acknowledge the pain she had caused. But now that it was here, I wasn't sure it mattered. What was an apology supposed to do? Undo all the years of neglect? Heal the wound she had left when she betrayed me again and again? I folded the letter and shoved it into the back of my desk drawer, telling myself I wasn't ready to deal with it. Maybe I wasn't ready to forgive her. Maybe I never would be. I wasn't sure if I even wanted a relationship with her again. Too much had happened, and the trust between us had been shattered long ago. But the letter stayed with me, lingering in my mind even as I tried to push it away. In a strange way, it made me think about my own healing, what I wanted for myself, and what it meant to truly let go of the past. Could I move forward without forgiving her? Or would that anger and resentment always be a part of me, holding me back, keeping me tied to the pain she had caused? A few weeks later, I got another letter. This one was from Ryan. I hadn't heard from him in years, not since before the lawsuit, when he was still too young to understand what was happening. I had tried to keep my distance after everything fell apart, figuring it was better for both of us if I stayed out of his life. But here he was, reaching out, his letter full of questions and confusion. "Why did Mom go to prison?" he asked. "Why didn't you ever tell me what was going on?" He was older now, old enough to understand the complexity of the situation. But he was still my little brother, and I could feel the hurt in his words. He had been caught in the crossfire of everything that had happened between me and my mother, and I had never considered how much it had affected him. In my effort to protect myself, I had forgotten that he was a victim of our fractured family, too. I sat down to write him back, struggling with what to say. How could I explain everything in a way that made sense to him? How could I justify the decisions I had made, the lawsuit cutting ties, letting our family fall apart? In the end, I told him the truth. I told him about my years of feeling like an outsider, about the affair, about how our mother had betrayed me by selling the apartment. I told him about the pain, the distance, and how it had all become too much to bear. But I also told him that none of this was his fault. He had always been my little brother, and nothing would change that. I hoped he could understand. Ryan's letter opened something in me. It made me realize that as much as I had tried to move forward, there were still parts of my past that I hadn't dealt with. I had pushed it all down, thinking that cutting my mother out of my life would heal the wounds, but it hadn't. The anger and hurt were still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be confronted. And so, I began to think about what forgiveness really meant. Not for her, but for me. After Ryan's letter, I spent a lot of time reflecting on the past, on everything I had been through and the choices I had made. I thought about my mother's apology, sitting untouched in the back of my desk drawer, and I thought about Ryan, trying to piece together his own understanding of our fractured family. Slowly, I began to realize that despite everything, I was still holding on to the pain. It was like a shadow that followed me everywhere, always lingering in the background. For so long, I had equated forgiveness with weakness. In my mind, forgiving my mother meant excusing her behavior, erasing all the hurt she had caused. But as the weeks passed, I began to see things differently. Forgiveness wasn't about her. It was about me. It was about letting go of the bitterness that had been poisoning me for years, about releasing the tight grip that the past still had on my heart. I didn't have to forget what had happened, or even reconcile with my mother, but I needed to free myself from the weight of it all. That realization didn't come easily, and it didn't come all at once. It was a slow, painful process, one that took time and patience. I started small, by acknowledging my feelings rather than pushing them down. I allowed myself to be angry, to be hurt, to grieve for the family I had lost and the childhood I never had. But instead of letting those feelings consume me, I began to understand that they didn't have to define me. I didn't have to carry them around forever. One afternoon, I sat down and read my mother's letter again. This time, I let myself truly absorb her words. Her apology felt different now. Not like an attempt to fix things, but a recognition of the pain she had caused. For the first time, I didn't see it as an admission of guilt, but as a human moment. A mother trying to reach out to her daughter in whatever way she could, however imperfectly. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking to be heard. And in that moment, I realized I was ready to hear her. I decided to visit her in prison. The decision wasn't easy. I hadn't seen my mother since the day of the sentencing, and the idea of facing her again, after everything that had happened, filled me with dread. But I knew this was something I needed to do, not for her, but for me. It was time to confront the past head-on, to stop running from it. The day of the visit, I felt a nervous energy building inside me. I had no idea what I would say or how I would feel when I saw her. As I sat in the waiting area, surrounded by the sterile walls and the quiet buzz of security guards, I questioned whether I was making the right decision. But there was no turning back now. I had to face her. When they finally brought her in, it felt like time had stopped. There she was, my mother, Linda, looking older, thinner, and more fragile than I had ever seen her. Her face softened when she saw me, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Vulnerability. It took everything in me not to break down right there. She sat down across from me, and for a long while, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick with everything that had been left unsaid between us. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "I didn't think you'd ever come," she said, her eyes searching mine for some kind of answer. "I didn't think I would either," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. We sat there, talking in circles at first, dancing around the real issues. She told me about her time in prison, about the therapy sessions, about how much she thought about me. I listened, not sure what to say, just letting her speak. I could hear the regret in her voice, the sadness that had settled deep into her bones. She wasn't the woman I had once known, the one who had pushed me aside, ignored me, hurt me. She was someone else now, broken in her own way. Finally, I spoke. I told her about the years of feeling invisible, about how hurt I was when Ryan came into the picture, about the betrayal of catching her in the affair. I told her how losing the apartment felt like the ultimate betrayal, the final proof that I didn't matter to her. I didn't hold back. Everything I had bottled up for years came spilling out. And for once, she didn't argue. She didn't defend herself or try to shift the blame. She just listened. "I'm sorry," she said again, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know I can't fix what I've done, but I want you to know that I do love you. I always have, even when I didn't show it." I sat there, taking in her words, feeling the rawness of the moment. A part of me wanted to reject her apology, to hold on to my anger and hurt. But another part of me, the part that had been waiting for this moment for years, felt something shift. I couldn't say whether I fully forgave her in that moment, but I knew that I didn't want to carry the pain anymore. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly, "but I'm trying to let go of the past. I need to move on." She nodded, her face crumpling with emotion. "I understand." When the visit ended, I left the prison with a strange sense of closure. My relationship with my mother was still broken, and I wasn't sure it would ever be fully repaired. But something had changed that day. I had faced the past, spoken my truth, and finally I felt free.